Hi guys, Shane here jumping in during the editing process just to let you know that this is going to be a two-part interview purely for the fact that the subject at hand is so in-depth and so detailed that we wouldn't have been able to cram it into a shortened and edited down 50-minute version like we usually would have for interviews or shows. Hence the reason it's split into two parts. So just want to say thank you very much for joining part one. And guys, you are going to learn something. You're going to be hit with some knowledge right here, right now. This is pure facts, pure science. I certainly learned something from it. Let's jump right in.
This is Random Urban Memories, brought to you by the Rum Boys. You've seen, heard, or felt it on the streets. Well, we're here to talk about it.
In 3, 2, 1.
Cool. So off we'll go. And hello, everybody. We have with us today Chris van Csefalvay.
Yep.
Did I say that correctly? Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Now, this is in response to the double episode that I did with the Twitter handle The Real Truther on Twitter. And it was an interview that we did that I think you had listened to as well. And we caught a lot of flack from the anti-vaxxers, purely for the fact that The Real Truther never claimed to be an expert. I never claimed to be an expert. We just gave back the facts of as we understood them and as they are there, and having been checked by experts. So the idea behind it was that we get an actual expert on this and go and have a talk about it, and maybe allay some fears that some people might have, or people who are sitting on the fence about this whole thing, and maybe give us some technical background on it. So, Chris, please introduce yourself on a personal or social media level, but of course, give only as much as you feel comfortable with.
Sure. So at Chris v. Csefalvay on Twitter, I run bitsandbugs.io, which is my website, and I am a computational epidemiologist. Before that, I used to do various different things, and my primary focus is, on one hand, filoviruses. That's Ebola, Marburg, that sort of those nice little creatures, and on the other hand, computational predictions of disease dynamics. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying computer modeling of how an infectious disease will behave in its natural human habitat. How will it spread, especially in urban areas, and how can we design cities in a way that they will be relatively more resilient to the spread of such infectious diseases. Now, I am not an immunologist, and I am not an MD. My education has been, as I said, in the field of epidemiology, which is not the same as infectious disease. Infectious disease is a medical specialty. Epidemiology is a rather more interdisciplinary field that's all about the study of and quantitative study of disease. The good thing is that gives us a rather wider outlook. So we can look at thousands of cases, tens of thousands of cases, millions of cases, even sometimes in some studies, and say whether something's safe or not. So I hope that perspective will be able to allay some of the fears and concerns about vaccines.
Well, I'm sure it will once we get into some of the nitty-gritty bits and pieces of it later on. And in terms of some of your educational history, and how did that feed into? How did you even get into the field? Actually,
that's actually a rather strange story, because I didn't actually do this as an undergraduate degree. It doesn't. I don't think it actually exists as an undergrad degree either. But I did an undergraduate degree in law, of all things. I went to the University of Oxford for an undergrad, and very briefly practiced law. I decided that wasn't for me, and I did some graduate work. I started focusing on statistics. I started focusing on basically statistics in clinical trials initially. And once I actually understood that this is a large and quite interesting field, I started to specialize in viral epidemiology and virology. That's where my obsession with filoviruses comes from. It's actually a rather fortuitous coincidence. It actually has to do with vaccines. Funnily enough, it turns out that for health reasons, an immune issue that I was born with, I couldn't have a number of vaccines that are required to work with level 3 pathogens. But level 4 pathogens, of course, are known for not having any. If I wanted to work with live hot pathogens, they would have had to be the level 4s, the worst of the worst, the incurables, the Ebolas, and that's how I started focusing on filoviruses. So I pretty much basically just hit a long journey that ended up with me working in quantitative epidemiology. And meanwhile, I, of course, picked up a lot of statistics and software development and all that, and computer modeling. It's a very interesting field because you have to be good at least 4 or 5 different things rather than just one discipline. You have to be a passable computer developer. You have to be a relatively, not relatively, you have to have a very solid understanding of physiology. You need to know your pathogen inside out. My area of academic interest and expertise at the moment is how certain viruses, in particular the ones that I'm concerned with, like Ebola, how they circumvent part of the human immune system. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. It gave me a look into the complexity of the human immune system because it is quite complex. It also afforded me a very interesting perspective into the wide array of strategies that various pathogens have for getting around it. So that's what I'm focusing on in my academic pursuits at the moment, because you also have to put bread on the table. I'm actually also advising governments on healthcare policy, doing quantitative assessments, working with various funding organizations and all that, crunching numbers, essentially doing the quantitative and predictive part of epidemiology and modeling.
And how does you're quite active on social media, and it's actually through social media that I kind of got into contact with you when I reached out to you, and you do join into these. I put them into inverted commas, but these debates, but what is in essence a pure misinformation campaign. What made you actually jump into those?
Curiosity, which killed the cat.
Yeah.
But also, I've got a little bit of a side interest in this because I look at these misinformation campaigns in their own right as a sort of infectious disease. So I was initially just curious. I just wanted to know, okay, so what are the dynamics of this? How does this work? Who spreads it? What's the reproduction rate? You can look at an idea, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. I'm not any idea. You can look at it as an infection. It spreads from one person to another. Some of the greatest ideas and some of the worst ideas in human history have propagated that way from one person to another. So I was initially just curious, and I don't know, there just came a point when I just bloody could no longer. Partly it's a sense of professional responsibility. It's rather hard to just see people do this level of public endangerment and just stand by. And partly also, I have to admit, I do have skin in the game to an extent. I'll be happy to talk about that at some point. I think everybody has skin in the game, so I don't think there's anybody who doesn't have an elderly relative or somebody undergoing treatment for cancer or an autoimmune condition that involves immunosuppression, or somebody who has a primary immune deficiency, or somebody who's just too young to be vaccinated. We all have these people in our lives. This isn't an isolated concern. This is about everybody.
Oh, absolutely. I do agree. And I think as well that you've got the hardcore nuts whom you'll never sway anyway, because that's their, and again in inverted commas, belief in something, and that is the end of it. But what I think is very important, the work that people like you and some of the others out there actually do, is to hopefully reach some of the fence sitters or the parents that are scared and unsure, which is totally understandable. Now, on the one hand, on social media, I think the anti-vaxxers get knocked pretty hard because they do some absolutely obscene shit sometimes. But there is people out there who have genuine concerns, and it's those people, I think, that would benefit most from conversations like this.
And who wouldn't? I mean, no,
absolutely.
Every time that I think doctors are still taught this. I'm not sure, but I've heard this from many of them. When a patient signs the consent form too quickly, that's a warning sign. Talk to them about it. And I very much agree with that. These are serious interventions. A vaccine is a medical intervention of sorts. It's administering a medicine. It has risks and side effects and all that, like anything in life. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable reaction to be apprehensive about it, considering the public atmosphere.
No, absolutely. And people tend to forget that as well, that it is a medical intervention, same as taking paracetamol, same as absolutely anything else that you do. And it all carries risks, including getting out of bed in the morning,
Yeah.
And can you tell me then as well? No, go ahead. What were you going to say?
No. I was just about to say that these risks are real, and where they exist, they are admitted by the pro-vaccine camp, if there's such a thing. I'm very, very impressed, and I have to say this, I'm very, very impressed by the people who are publicly speaking out for vaccines on social media, with some extremely few exceptions, maybe one or two exceptions among thousands. They are all very, very coherent, educated, and calm people, and I think they make fantastic points. Most importantly, they never deny the truth that, yes, vaccines do carry side effects. Every drug carries side effects. I've just looked at the side effects of loperamide, which is an over-the-counter anti-diarrheal, and it's one of the safest drugs around, but it has side effects. And there is a degree of intellectual honesty in admitting it, and I think the reason why I point this out is that the pro-vaccine camp never gets the recognition it deserves for the completeness and for the comprehensiveness of the communication from its side. The fact that they do disclose facts that might be, quote, harmful to their own case, unquote. So as anti-vaccine activists want to present what pro-vaccine activists say, would be that we're all paid by Big Pharma to say, yay, vaccines are fantastic and never have any side effects. And that is demonstrably not true.
No, 100%. And now that that's what I found. I always find the anti-vaxxers shout, read the inserts. Yeah, the inserts are literally written by the drug manufacturers. and that for some reason is taken as gospel. But every study, nope, all fake. So it's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there.
Yes, because the inserts, in their own way, favor their position. It's the same with VAERS. The inserts are, or PIs as we call them, they are a legal document. As a legal document, they have to disclose everything, and what they have to disclose is actually, for the US inserts, regulated in the Food and Drugs Act, Food, Drugs and Cosmetics Act. What they have to disclose there is essentially everything that has occurred, unless they can exclude it for a particular reason. That's how autism came off the list. It took a lot of really high predictive power studies for autism to be dropped from the possible side effects list. The reality is that if you test a drug, any drug, on a cohort of thousands or tens of thousands of people, you're bound to get a couple of those events that have a constant probability, or as I tend to say, uniform distribution over time. You're bound to get somebody who's going to die in a car crash. If you test a drug on children between the ages of 14 and 18, there will guaranteed be somebody who will die in a car crash in the trial period, if your numbers are sufficiently high. In reality, if you had to write a package insert for any object around you right now, I guarantee you would have to mention some pretty serious stuff. The next object to me right now is a book. People have died after reading books. A book can fall on your head and crack it wide open. Pretty sure there's been an instance of somebody, having an occult aneurysm in the brain that burst when a book fell on it. So, yeah, the ways in which this book on algorithms and bioinformatics could kill you would probably be longer than the safety sheet for any vaccine. This is just not a good source for an argument. And unfortunately, the more they say, read the inserts, they're pointing parents who are already quite confused to an extremely confusing, usually quite badly written, long document. It's not badly written because the manufacturers or the people who write it don't know their job. It's badly written because it's written to conform letter to letter to legal guidelines. Now, if anybody's idea of informative reading is a legal disclaimer, then sure, read the insert. But I think most people know that it's a lot more complex than that. And if I could have one advice to parents, by all means, read the insert, but have some other source than the insert, and understand that that insert exists for a very particular purpose. It doesn't exist to tell you what the risks and benefits of this vaccine are. It exists to essentially comply with a piece of legislation.
And to basically inform you of what has happened to the people in the study. And as far as I remember, it was one of the HPV inserts in which, off the top of my head, I think it was 10 deaths within the study, but each and every one of them was down to various other reasons, but it wasn't the actual vaccine. But that was just because those people died during the study, and it had to be recorded and it has to be listed.
Yes.
So just for people to understand that is why there was 10 deaths recorded, but you can actually trace them back, and they had nothing to do with the vaccine. It was car crashes and other I think a plane crash even as well. Some very tragic circumstances. But again, it had to be recorded because those people, it affected people in the study. And while we're talking about big pharma and whatnot, and especially with you working on a disease that theoretically or technically doesn't have much, or I can't imagine it having much of a profit margin because the incidence rates are relatively low on a global scale. How does a profit factor play into this? Because it's everything is, big pharma profit, big pharma, big pharma, big pharma. But in the end, you've got NGOs, you've got other people working on these vaccines for no profit or barely any profit for it to even take over kind of thing. So how does that concept even work, or how does that actually play out? I know there's many systems which to consider, but if you could just give a word on that then as well.
I know that the company that developed what looked for a while as a cure of sorts for Ebola virus infection, say a cocktail of 3 monoclonal antibodies known as ZMapp, has actually not made a single penny on what they actually produced, because all of it was given away, essentially. Drug companies give away a lot of pharmaceuticals. They do give away a lot of pharmaceuticals. There are entire pharmaceuticals that are virtually never sold at their full price. They're either completely sold under various arrangements or compassionate use arrangements. There are pharmaceuticals that are almost exclusively sold to governments that pay for it, and then the government uses it. An example for that is a drug that I mention quite a lot. It's called millarceprol. It's for a form of sleeping sickness, trypanosomiasis, and that millarceprol is an extremely nasty drug. When I say it's extremely nasty, it itself kills a couple of % of the people who get it. It's so caustic that you actually can't use plastic tubing for it. You have to keep it in a glass syringe. But, if you have neurotrypanosomiasis, so it started to affect the brain and nervous system, that drug remains your best bet, pretty much. And virtually all of that drug is released for free by the manufacturer or sold to public health authorities. In the US, it's the CDC who has a stock of it and releases it as needed. So the profit motive, when it comes to what we call NTDs, neglected tropical diseases, the profit motive, it just isn't there. With regard to vaccines in general, vaccines themselves do not generate a lot of profit. What they do generate is an incredible opportunity cost. And that incredible opportunity cost means that if the same amount of resources, be it human resources, research, manufacturing, logistics, etc., that goes into a drug, would be diverted from the vaccines to, other biologicals. There's a killing to be made on other biologicals at the moment, especially cancer immunotherapies and various immune system disorder therapies. They're expensive drugs. They're expensive drugs. There are drugs for rheumatoid arthritis where a single bag of that IV costs more than the entire vaccine schedule for a person. So, there are treatments now that cost. You might have heard of CAR-T, which is trade name in the US is Kymriah, and it's a therapy for multiple myeloma, and it's very promising for various other cancers. Uses the patient's own T cells to attack the tumors, and that's $500,000, $500,000 for the treatment. That is incredible. Same for Spinraza, which has been in the press, which is also another very, very expensive drug for spinal muscular atrophy. So, there are areas where you can spend your money as a pharmaceutical manufacturer and get a great return. On the whole, vaccines aren't really it. The reason why pharmaceutical manufacturers still do it is partly because if they stop doing it, somebody else will dominate the market, and that's investors don't like that. And the other reason is I've worked with plenty of executives in big pharma, and I have a lot of friends and family who work for various pharmaceutical companies. So I'm officially a shill for big pharma.
I was just going to call you a shill.
Thank you very much. There's no doubt I'm a shill. But I've got to say, shockingly, not everybody who's working in big pharma is actually a spawn of Satan. So I think a lot of them do realize the public health necessity of safe and effective vaccines. And a lot of them take providing these quite seriously.
And that's a method to do it. So
yes.
And to get down and break down, and just in case anyone is wondering, we're recording this on a beach in the Bahamas that the shill books have provided for us. So
Indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's
we got here on Shane's private jet. Fantastic. I should start a shill podcast just for.
I'm telling you, each and every one of those tweets, millions and millions.
Yeah.
By the way, that and it was the real truth that had said it as well. That is by far the worst economic scheme ever invented. If you paid so many pro-vaxxers per tweet, yeah, like as powerful and as massive as the pharma companies are, they would be bankrupt pretty quick, and people would be tweeting a hell of a lot more, I think, especially about specific products.
I mean,
but anyway,
there are ways to manipulate public opinion, but individually arguing with anti-vaxxers, I don't think
really
that's that's not scalable and not very much.
It doesn't work like that. But then again, if you have troll farms that in their thousands of accounts start changing public opinion, then you're talking a different game.
That's a different game, but they are not primarily focused on individual engagement. What they primarily they look for messages to amplify. They look for people who use a particular keyword, and then they have canned messages that they send to them. That sort of stuff. And
that's a horrific form of public sphere influence, actually. But that's
indeed.
You can do a 10-hour episode on that. That's incredible what they're actually up to.
Well, funnily enough, actually, quite a few people in epidemiology have been looking at how the ways that we deal with infectious diseases could be used to isolate and eliminate the effect of such bad actors on social media. Same field.
Well, you said it earlier. It is a form of disease, this misinformation campaigns, and sometimes very targeted misinformation campaigns. Like you said, certain hashtags, certain waves of things being amplified and then being repeated so often that it becomes the truth kind of thing. So yeah, no, absolutely. It's a super interesting field.
One of the things that have sort of become the truth is that there is a controversy. And I think that's quite... One side is so incredibly loud that now parents who have not, who are sitting on a fence, who don't really know much about vaccines and never really cared a lot. They might have had their shots, but other than that, nothing. This isn't their life. And now they have a toddler, and they're thinking about, okay, should they receive the vaccines or not? And they get the idea that there is a valid controversy with two sides to the story, when in reality there is an overwhelming majority opinion, and there are a couple of people with fringe views. There is no controversy about pyramids were built by humans or aliens, just because there's a few strange people who believe it's the latter. But because the opinions of of anti-vaccine activists have been amplified by so much. There's a perception in parents that there is a valid controversy here, there is a disagreement here, and if people disagree, I best listen to both sides. This is what I tend to call the principle of false equivalence. There are now demands by anti-vaccine activists like RFK Jr. that somebody sit down and debate them. The correct answer to that is the answer that most people have given him, which is that if we sit down and debate, that makes it look like there is something to debate about. There isn't. We don't sit down and debate about whether Hitler was a good guy or whether the sky is red. We don't debate things that are manifestly untrue.
And I completely agree. There shouldn't be airtime given to these, because there is no debate. You're 100% correct. What you can debate is how you feel about a certain policy. You can debate how maybe a book should have ended, or what's your opinion on a movie. But these are irrefutable facts. There is no debate about them. So that's something completely different, and that's something very, very much important to remember. And for anyone unsure out there, there is a reason why there has collectively millions of people been in these studies. How come it's just consistently been proven again and again and again and again? So yeah, anything else is just it's lies being thrown around. And speaking of lies, that's actually a pretty good segue. Thanks for bringing that up. Let's go on a relatively quick fire round. A few of the tropes that are again and again coming up here, and I think they're some of the most common ones. And sorry if I forgot one or two of them or a couple of them, because there's just so many tropes that the anti-vaxxers use, and they come up again, and they morph, they change, and one quarter it's mercury, the next quarter it's aluminium, because they all somehow work off a central switch, and that switch is whatever the theme that they're going to complain about now, or most likely spam you with links. So let's kick it off a little bit with hygiene and sanitations. That's something you hear the whole time. It was sanitation that eradicated diseases. What's your take on that?
I've always found it an extremely weird argument. I find it a weird argument because, for starters, okay, so let me start by this. Sanitation is great. Bad sanitation is bad. Bad sanitation does make diseases more frequent. The reverse, that good sanitation eliminates them, is sadly not true. Now, how do we know this? We know this through two things. One is, we know that the vaccines didn't save us, it was all sanitation trope, is just biologically not feasible for one simple reason. If it's sanitation, then it should basically eliminate most pathogens either at the same time, or as sanitation becomes more stringent and we get better antiseptics, in the order of their susceptibility. But that is not the case. We have we do need to vaccinate against pathogens that are relatively easy to kill. The flu virus is an example. The flu virus is relatively easy to kill. Bleach, we had the tools for killing it for the last several hundred years, if not more. While smallpox, the one virus that's been conclusively eradicated, the one human virus anyway, is one of the hardiest viruses that we know. It's an extremely resilient virus. There are smallpox cabs that are decades old and continue to be pathogenic. So if this were true, and again I'm saying hygiene is great, but hygiene didn't stop or vastly reduce infectious disease. And we know that because whenever vaccination rates went down infectious disease started going back up, even if, hygienic situation didn't change. B, we know that as soon as vaccines entered the scene, as soon as vaccination campaigns became big, they immediately started to have an effect on the disease involved. And it's, with one or two pathogens, I might say, you can't know. But when you see some, when you see that every pathogen's disease, so every disease incidence rate followed vaccines and vaccination campaigns so closely, within a couple of years, it just basically went down to near zero. You know that there is something else going on. The way hygiene looks and works hasn't changed all that much since I would say since after World War II. There's been no major superb sea changes. We do the same thing. We chlorinate water and don't have shit running in the streets, and we just generally try to wash our hands and all that. It still, on its own, didn't make a difference.
Well, if you look at some of the rates of polio per year in 2008, it was 559 or so averaging cases per year, and then within 2 years it went down to 42. I think that was the vaccine. Not much has changed in the sanitation or the hygiene standards, especially in certain parts of India. So yeah, so that's something that cannot be and just isn't. It's just an outright.
India is actually an interesting example, like you said, because there's they were using the oral polio vaccine there, which actually exploits bad sanitary conditions. What it does is it spreads a heavily attenuated virus so that people will catch this virus and develop immunity against it with a very, very low risk of developing the neurological symptoms of polio. So so bad sanitary situations were actually exploited to reach the most people faster. And then when you start to have a relatively high number of people who are now immune, you should generally switch to the injected polio vaccine. I think India has kind of dropped the ball on that, and that's causing issues there. But nonetheless, undoubtedly, there are places in the world with near zero prevalence of polio that are really not the hallmark or the epitome of hygienic conditions. And there are far more hygienic Western countries that are now experiencing a resurgence of various other infectious diseases, measles.
Well, it tends to be, or the high amount of anti-vaxxers or some of the outbreaks that have happened are in some of the most hygienic conditions you can think of, as in well-to-do, generally healthy, and obviously with good sanitation around them, that kind of thing. And there's pockets of outbreaks in these communities. So that kind of speaks against that theory then. Well, here's one I heard on Twitter, but I think that's not even worth talking about, to be honest with you. But it's somebody had said that disease did not exist before vaccines.
That's interesting. There's actually there's a branch of medical history that actually traces when a particular disease was first described, and from what we know, quite a lot of disease has existed pretty far back, I would say. So polio is a great example. Because there's a whole book on it. J.R. Paul has written a book on the history of polio. It's a book from 1971, so that was relatively close to the aftermath of, at the very least, a near elimination of it. And turns out that there's evidence of persons with polio going back as far as ancient Egypt. we know Hippocrates has described mumps 2,500 years ago. So disease most definitely did exist. There was something called the Black Death that basically killed about a third of Europe's population, which we now pretty much believe to be an infection by Yersinia pestis, as well as the plague. So, which in turn can have various manifestations, including pneumonic plague, which is not great, and bubonic plague, which is also not great, but a little more survivable. So that's the one with the skin symptoms, and pneumonic plague is the one that causes you to just go and die. And also, on the whole, the idea is a little weird. Why would Jenner invent vaccination if there's no disease to vaccinate against? I don't really get the idea. Get the idea here. So because there's no disease before vaccination, Jenner invents vaccines against smallpox because there is no smallpox. That somehow just doesn't compute for me.
Well, in fact, they found a cancer in a stem turtle bone from 240 million years ago, and it looked pretty much like an osteosarcoma that humans would have.
It's quite interesting, yeah.
That's. I don't think that's really a point that they made. See how great Twitter can be. And as
I have to admit, that's actually the one about disease not existing is something I haven't heard before.
I tell you what, I'll try and it's a good while ago now, but if I happen to find it, I'll tag you in it.
That's
if
incredible.
I see it. It's incredible.
That is incredible. That's new even for me.
And I tell you, there was a whole bunch of us arguing with each other on whether this is a troll account or not. But when you look at it, it seemed quite real. It seemed like there was a person behind it. So it's getting harder to tell sometimes, but it was quite incredible. Yeah. Let's go through some of the ingredients of ingredients of some of the vaccines, because they are mostly the ones that are being shouted about, are mostly in contention with the anti-vaxxers. So let's start off with one of the ones that you see every single day, the DNA of aborted fetal cells. Okay, so what's the medical basis for the case, and what does fetal DNA actually mean? I think what they think it is, it contains contaminated fetal tissue inside the vaccines. What does it really mean?
Yeah, that's actually a lot better when they say fetal DNA, because dead aborted baby is the typical version of what you get. So
well, yeah, exactly.
So yeah, let's go through what it actually means. The origin of the idea is that if you want viruses, you can't culture viruses the way you can culture bacteria. If you have a bacterium and you want more bacteria, what you do is you put them on a little petri dish with, give them a lot of nutrients, and they will eventually, consume those nutrients and go forth and multiply. Unfortunately, you can't do that with viruses. The reason for that is that viruses depend on the machinery of a cell to create copies of themselves. So you need a cell culture to multiply this. Now, cell cultures are a somewhat complicated story. The problem with cell cultures is that cells do not live forever. If they did, we would have big problems. An example of cells that attempt to live forever is, of course, cancer. So normally you have cells that after a number of divisions enter a stage known as cellular senescence, which is realizing that they're too old to safely replicate anymore, and the cell just dies. There's the mechanism for that actually has to do with little caps called telomeres at the end of every chromosome, and at every division a little bit of it is whittled down, and when those telomere caps are gone, it's time for the cell to die, basically. So what you need in order to efficiently manufacture large amounts of viral particles is a way to have a culture of cells that just continues to divide and divide and divide, because you need to replenish the ones that are killed by virus as it divides, or rather as it replicates within the cells. And that's the problem solved by cell lines, or immortal and immortalized cell lines. Now, this is by no means new. It actually is a kind of old story about, going on 70 years old now. And it's the first cell culture that of human tissue that really worked well. It is a very widespread culture. It's called HeLa. And the reason why it's called HeLa is because it came from a tissue sample taken from a tumor from a lady called Henrietta Lacks. Now, at this point, I'll have to say that this happened without her knowledge and consent, and she's a wonderful, wonderful person who beyond the grave continued to have an immense effect on human health. And if you want to read more about Henrietta Lacks's life and story, Rebecca Skloot has a book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's also, by the way, a fantastic introduction into how cell cultures work for a lay audience. Now, okay, back to the two cell lines that are most implicated in vaccines. One is one called MRC5, and the other is Wistar38. You see this usually abbreviated as WI38. And all of these come from the 1960s. All of these are cells that were taken from the lung parenchymal tissue, so basically the tissue that lines the inside of the lungs of fetuses that were legally aborted at the time. The important point, number one, to nail down here is at one point a single cell sample was taken from 2 aborted fetuses, one male, one female, and no more. So there's no need, vaccine manufacturers have no need for a constant stream of aborted tissue. They're not encouraging abortion so that they can lay their hands on more, because they don't need to. Because what they did was actually create an immortalized cell line from these 2 cells. And what that means is they essentially disabled that cell's cellular senescence mechanism, and the cell just continued to divide and divide and divide. And if you keep it in the right culture medium, you yourself can take a single cell and you will have thousands and hundreds and thousands of those cells in your lab fridge within a couple of weeks. Now, cell culture is a tricky business. You have to be extremely assiduous. You have to be very clever. You have to know how not to let fungal infection or some other infection into your cell culture. But most importantly, it allows you essentially a virus factory. And that's what these cell cultures are used for. Now, the way a vaccine is made up, it contains an antigen, which is something that is either, a dead virus or a bacterium, or a live virus or bacterium, or a part of a virus's outer shell, or a polysaccharide, a sugar-like molecule that is part of the surface antigens of the original pathogen. And you pair that with an adjuvant and inject it. Now, in order to create a lot of copies of arbitrary viruses, be it polio or measles or mumps, what you will need is a reliable way of doing this. And there's no more reliable way than a culture that consists of copies of exactly the same cell, which is what a cell culture is. Now, about the DNA and cells. The DNA and the cells are actually, not the DNA, but the cells themselves are actually consumed by the bacteria, by the viruses. The viruses that are multiplying in that culture actually kill off these cells. And normally they are separated. There is a relatively easy way to separate viruses from cells. It relies on the fact that viruses are very, very small and cells are relatively very, very big. That's basically how viruses were discovered. You can put, they can go through various sorts of filters. But assume that a cell, for some bizarre reason, makes it through. The viruses are then usually inactivated, or at the very least, what goes through is cleansed so that any cell that goes through is basically broken up into a billion little parts. But okay, what about the DNA? Well, there might be some residual DNA floating around in that cell culture liquid. And yes, DNA is fairly small, so it might make its way through the filter. There are two important issues here. One is, what is it that actually makes it into the vaccine? And the other is, what are its effects? So I'll start with the first. What makes it into the vaccine? Well, fortunately, most ways of manufacturing vaccines involve the use of something called nucleases, which basically break a long nucleic acid like DNA or RNA into a lot of little pieces. Now, I say little pieces. They are quite short. They are up to 10, 20 base pairs. Now, at that point, I don't think there is a sensible way to say this is fetal DNA or this is male DNA or female DNA. Now, I don't think there's a sensible way of saying this is human DNA. This is basically a tiny fragment, and if I give you an arbitrary, randomly generated 10 or 20 length, base pair length oligonucleotide, there is a good chance that you will find it in a lot of different organisms. Because, there are, if you zoom in sufficiently deeply, parts of your DNA are shared with other organisms. Large parts of it, large intact single segments, are shared with other mammals. Very small bits of it are shared with pretty much everything in existence. So there isn't really such a thing as fetal DNA or human DNA at that oligonucleotide level. In fact, below chromosomal level, there's just no point talking about these concepts. Now, what would happen, however, if intact DNA were to be injected? Well, the answer to that is that pretty much nothing. Unless it's a vast quantity of DNA, the human body has ways to get rid of it. A lot of DNA enters your body through your life, including your bloodstream. Every time you have a scrape and some bacterium lands on it or some viral particle lands on it, which happens all the time, that virus enters your bloodstream, and if you're fortunate, your immune system is going to whack it. Every time you eat some meat, there are cells in it. The cells have nucleic acids in it, and your body has a mechanism to take those nucleotides apart and reuse them. So on the whole, this is like a multi-layered cake of wrong. It's wrong because even if it did, there wouldn't be an issue, and it's wrong because it doesn't. There's no there's no transit of any DNA that or of any significant size other than small oligonucleotides. Now, there have been some very spurious arguments about how injection of because one of these cell lines are nominally male and the other are nominally female cells. This leads to the newfound prevalence of gender confusion and all that, and that's of course preposterous. That's like saying if you eat meat from cows only or from female chickens only as a guy, you will start to doubt your sexuality, and that's obvious nonsense.
That just doesn't work like that.
No, it doesn't work like that at all.
And we are going to jump in here and make this the end of part 1, as mentioned before. So definitely tune in for part 2, because we're all still learning right here, right now. Keep your ears to the ground. Part 2 is happening real soon. And thanks for listening.
You managed to listen to the Rum Boys talk on Random Urban Memories. Just like and subscribe where you can on all platforms.